Merci beaucoup, Cédric. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you for your attendance here. Thank you for this invitation. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I want to And for those of you who might be watching elsewhere, I want to acknowledge why I acknowledge. This land acknowledgement honors First Nations as the first stewards of this land. It recognizes the painful history during which First Nations were displaced from their territories. And it also points to the possibility of reconciliation, the opportunity for renewal that comes from acknowledging and confronting our past. I want to thank all the elders, the drum, and the leaders gathered here today, and those who will gather over the next 2 days. And I want to extend a special thanks to National Chief Woodhouse Nipanak for her invitation and her leadership. I also want to thank the AFN regional chiefs and the entire team at the Assembly of First Nations for bringing us together today, bringing us together this week, and including me in this gathering. Merci à toutes les personnes présentes dans cette salle pour les discussions, les conseils et le travail que nous accomplissons ensemble. At the outset, I want to make clear that Canada's new government is committed to working directly with you to build stronger nation-to-nation relationships. For it's only by working together that we can build stronger, more prosperous First Nations communities and a stronger, more resilient Canada. In a more dangerous and divided world, Canada is choosing to build, from major national projects to local infrastructure, including in housing and water. And above all, we are choosing to build brighter futures for all our people across this great land. This mission of building is a positive endeavor. The question is not what we're against, but what we're for, what we want to build together. Because this approach must be informed by and can only move forward with First Nations. Il s'agit d'une approche qui nous unit autour d'une mission commune visant à créer des opportunités et à favoriser la prospérité partout au Canada. Now, it's not just what we build, it's how we build. We build Canadian. We build sustainably. And crucially, we will build in partnership by upholding Indigenous rights and building in ways that First Nations communities have greater security and greater prosperity. Le nouveau gouvernement du Canada sera un partenaire indéfectible, et ce, en respectant notre détermination, en reconnaissant que le partenariat commence par une compréhension commune et en faisant de l'équité et de la participation des Autochtones une priorité au moment de bâtir notre pays. First Nations leadership, prosperity, and opportunity must be foundational. And laying this foundation begins with engagement. And that's why this summer I held 3 summits to engage First Nations, Inuit, and Métis leadership about your priorities, about their priorities, to discuss opportunities for communities, for equity ownership, for resource management of major projects. Over 430 First Nations were represented at the first summit in Gatineau. Lors de ce sommet, j'ai clairement entendu que ce partenariat devait inclure le respect, de l'autodétermination et un engagement contenu envers la Déclaration des Nations Unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones, ainsi que le consentement libre, préalable et éclairé. J'ai aussi entendu que vous avez beaucoup d'idées et d'ambitions, et ensemble, ayons l'audace et l'ambition de les réaliser. C'est ainsi que nous irons de l'avant ensemble. Cet été, j'ai aussi entendu plusieurs bonnes idées pour des grands projets et des petits projets. Now, nation building carries more than one meaning. Yes, projects that build our national economy, and through Indigenous equity and management that help build First Nations. And this is not an aspiration. This is not an idea. It is the law. Specifically, under the Build Canada Act, for a project to be in Canada's national interest, it must strengthen our country's autonomy, resilience, and security. It must contribute to clean growth and align with our climate change objectives. And it must, by law, advance the interests of Indigenous peoples. Thank you. So to move from legislation to action, we launched the Major Projects Office to coordinate the development and financing of potential nation-building projects. That office has held several regional engagements with rights holders to encourage meaningful partnership and involvement of First Nations. And to ensure that Indigenous participation is embedded throughout this process, we have created the Indigenous Advisory Council. But let me be absolutely clear. None of this engagement counts as consultation. That process of consultation only starts once projects are referred as possibilities to the Major Projects Office. Under the legislation, there must be consultation consistent with free, prior and informed consent before a project can be designated in Canada's national interest, and none have been so far. But even once one is designated, even once that happens, there must be additional consultations on the conditions necessary for that project to succeed. And these conditions, these issues would naturally include requirements for Indigenous ownership, Indigenous economic benefits, and environmental protections. Now let me illustrate that by giving a quick example of a strategy that Major Projects Office is currently evaluating. It's called the Northwest Critical Conservation Corridor. The corridor is in an area of northwest British Columbia that sits atop vast deposits of critical minerals and has the potential to connect the clean electricity grid of BC to the power grids of Yukon and Alberta while creating a new conservation area the size of Greece. The proposed North Coast transmission line at the heart of this project has the potential to create $10 billion in new economic activity, while reducing emissions by up to 3 million tonnes annually. It would also enable the expansion of the Red Chris mine to be built in close, direct collaboration with the Tahltan Nation. That mine will increase Canada's annual copper production by over 15% and employ 1,500 workers during operations and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by over 70%. The North Coast transmission line would also enable the Silesums LNG, owned by the Niska Nation, which will become Canada's second largest and one of the world's lowest emission LNG operations. In the coming months, through consultations with First Nations and on the advice of the Major Projects Office, we'll determine whether to formally designate these projects as being in the national interest, and if so, following further consultations, set the relevant conditions for these projects to proceed. Les projets comme celui-ci créeront des milliers de carrières bien rémunérées et apporteront une sécurité, une certitude et une prospérité durable aux communautés des Premières Nations. Être un partenaire fiable pour les Premières Nations va au-delà du simple respect de l'obligation de consultation. Cela implique également la création de richesses à long terme pour les Premières Nations grâce à une participation équitable et intégrale. Ces projets ont le potentiel d'agir comme une source de revenus autonome et fiable pour les communautés, une source de la richesse nécessaire pour la réalisation de vos priorités. To empower First Nations to own and lead major projects, our government has doubled the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program to $10 billion. Nous avons prévu 40 millions de dollars pour la participation et le renforcement des capacités des Premières Nations. Il s'agit d'un financement direct destiné à vos communautés afin que vous contribuerez à déterminer ce que nous pouvons bâtir ensemble. Now, as we build our nations, we must build strong communities. Over $16 billion has been invested thus far in over 13,000 projects that support Indigenous community infrastructure. Infrastructure that's central to the strength of those communities. Many aspects of this, I would like to focus today on two areas: housing and water. We've just created a new agency, Build Canada Homes, which will partner with First Nations and other orders of government to supercharge housing construction, using new factory technologies that cut building times by 50%, reduce costs by 20%, and lower emissions by 20%. Build Canada Homes will directly engage with First Nations to build affordable housing with a focus on Indigenous-led solutions, financial support, and those innovative construction methods. It's our vision that Build Canada Homes will incorporate Indigenous housing providers' knowledge and their leadership in these housing projects. Par ailleurs, j'ai demandé à la ministre des Services autochtones de collaborer avec vous au cours de la prochaine année afin de trouver une meilleure façon de répondre à vos besoins en matière de logement, notamment dans les réserves. Il faut, entre autres, veiller à ce que le programme de logement de la SCHL, au titre de l'article 95, se fonde sur les données de dernier recensement afin de répondre efficacement aux besoins des communautés. We want to build housing where First Nation families live. And to support the around two-thirds of First Nations peoples that live off reserve, we have committed $2.8 billion in Budget 2025 for off-reserve, urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing. And we confirm $1.7 billion to build on-reserve housing. Le gouvernement collaborera avec les dirigeants réunis ici afin d'élaborer des solutions abordables pour répondre aux besoins non satisfaits en matière de logement des Premières Nations. Building the homes we all need is one of the core missions of our government. That's why we're making a generational investment overall of $13 billion in housing through Build Canada Homes. And this is on top of the funding, $5 billion since 2016, invested directly in on-reserve housing. We're also moving forward with the essential work of building infrastructure on reserve, beginning with recognizing, as we all do, that clean water is foundational. Over the last decade, 85% of drinking water advisories on reserve have been lifted through investments of over $7 billion since 2016. Our government is committed to ending the remaining 38 advisories, and we've allocated in this budget an additional $2.3 billion for that purpose. Now, we recognize that we need a more permanent solution through a coordinated approach supported by the right funding mechanism and working with the provinces and territories at the table. This is a top priority for our government. And I'm pleased, the National Chief and I have discussed this, I'm pleased to announce that I will host early in the new year a joint federal, provincial, territorial First Ministers meeting with First Nations. And you will set the agenda. I'm sure that coordination and solutions on water will be one of the main items. I also can confirm that under the leadership of the Minister of Indigenous Services, this government intends to introduce water legislation in the spring of 2026. We will complete the crucial work as well, led by the Minister of Indigenous Services, to reform child and family services. This will help ensure the First Nations children grow up safe, secure, deeply connected to their families, their culture, their language. Our approach to child welfare will be First Nations-led, community-led, and it will be supported by significant additional funding. Now let me move towards a conclusion. That's a euphemism. I'm not quite ready to conclude, but I'm moving towards. Because I want to say a few words about a fundamental issue in relationships, which is trust. Because building together, you can only build together with trust. And I recognize that trust is never a given. It can only be earned, and it's earned through sustained action over time. Trust grows through partnership. Il faut donc collaborer de manière continue, dès le début et de façon transparente avec les dirigeants des Premières Nations à mesure que nous bâtissons des infrastructures en vigueur visant à transformer nos économies. Trust is built by openness. I will always be straight about the challenges we face and the choices we must take together. And while our government has just undertaken a rigorous spending review in advance of the budget, we protected the essential programs of Indigenous Services Canada and the work of Crown Indigenous Relations. Core services such as health care, community safety, child and family services, education, and mental wellness, all of these will continue to progress. This builds on the over 400% increase in investments in Indigenous communities over the past decade. It also means that we recognize, that while outcomes have in many cases improved, there has not been as much progress as any of us would want, and certainly not enough progress, especially for the children who deserve it the most. So we will work together to better focus, appropriately scale and optimize these investments to maximize their impact. And that should mean more First Nations-led solutions, greater funding directly to rights holders with better measurement of outcomes. And finally, trust requires listening, even when the truth is difficult to hear. Canada's new government is moving forward on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls for action. We are advancing the calls for justice from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Nous mettons en œuvre la loi relative à la Déclaration des Nations Unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones en partenariat avec les peuples autochtones. Now I just want to close with an image, one illustration of how central I see us making reconciliation to our government's mandate. One of the first things I did when I came into office was to borrow a painting in the National Gallery by a First Nations artist, and it's installed just outside the Cabinet Room in Parliament. It's called A Brief History of Northwest Coast Design by Luke Parnell, and it depicts a part of our history through 11 wooden panels with images inspired by the designs on bentwood boxes and feast bowls. The first few of these panels burst with vibrant colors. And then, with colonial contact, those colors fade, till the middle ones become smothered in white paint, a culture literally whitewashed. The final panels resemble the original glory, with images that, although marked by what has been endured, are renewed and resurgent. This painting, to me, captures both the pain of suppression and the possibility of reconciliation. Cette possibilité repose sur la vérité. La vérité est le fondement de la justice. La réconciliation est une tâche qui doit être vécue et pratiquée à chaque jour. This painting is the last image that my ministers and I see before we enter the Cabinet Room to make some of the most important decisions for our country's future. And it's the first image we see when we leave, charged with the responsibility of implementing those decisions to create a better future. It's a reminder to us of the progress that's been made, the work that remains to achieve all that we can imagine and build together. Thank you very much for your attention. Merci beaucoup, and I look forward to your questions.